During what he promised to be an important announcement yesterday, President Donald Trump linked autism to the use of acetaminophen during pregnancy. The Trump administration is now advising doctors to prescribe Tylenol to pregnant women, which the primary ingredient is acetaminophen, to pregnant women only in cases where a high fever could pose a risk to the baby. The president drawing a link between the use of the active ingredient in Tylenol, acetaminophen, and autism in children, even though no study has yet to find a causal connection. Here's President Trump at the press conference yesterday.
Effective immediately, the FDA will be notifying physicians that the use of let's see how we say that. Acetaminophen. Is that okay? Which is basically commonly known as Tylenol during pregnancy, can be associated with a very increased risk of autism.
He said that pregnant women should only be urged to take Tylenol for medical issues like extreme fever.
It's a small number of cases, I think. But if you can't tough it out, if you can't do it, that's what you're going to have to do. You'll take a Tylenol, but it'll be very sparingly.
There was a couple of things.
Sorry, Holly.
So first of all, I think you learned this relatively early on, maybe even in high school, that correlation does not equal causation, right? So yes, there has been an increase in the diagnoses of autism, but we talked yesterday that autism as a separate diagnosis was first diagnosed in 1911. Tylenol didn't come on the scene until 1955. And in recent years, the use of Tylenol has actually decreased, right? So first of all, you have to be careful with correlation and causation. And then second of all, telling women they just need to tough it out is, first of all, offensive. But second of all, saying, if you can't tough it out, then take a single Tylenol. But we're talking about the risk to the baby of a mom having a high fever. It can cause really significant damage if mom has a high fever, especially over an extended period of time.
And alternatives to Tylenol, which would include aspirin and Motrin, ibuprofen,
yeah,
have bleeding risks.
They do.
Which Tylenol limits.
So we have with us in studio Lois Collins from the Deseret News. She wrote about this issue for today's paper, maybe yesterday's. I read it this morning. But really, Lois, I wonder if you could just break it down, what we're seeing on both sides, right? Because I know there was a pretty strong response from the medical community as well.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting question because there was a study that was done at Harvard and Mount Sinai that did find some association, and they were careful to say they couldn't find causation in that, but they did find some association. And that's kind of what this has been pinned on, is a single study that found that. There was another study that was conducted that was between Sweden and the United States. It was a big international study with tons of pregnancies involved that looked like it might have a tiny bit of an increase, but when they controlled for siblings, it turned out there wasn't an increase. It was, as the scientists said, flatlined. So I think there's just so much confusion right now about what to believe. And, there's beforehand, I had a couple of experts who said to me, well, but I thought that we were told by the same administration that it was certain vaccines. Mm-hmm. And maybe he'll tie that in. And in fact, that was tied in. They think that it's a complex combination of things that involves vaccines and it involves acetaminophen. And so avoid everything and you won't have these complications. But the problem is that Tylenol, or acetaminophen, Tylenol is the branded name, but there are other products that contain acetaminophen as well. So you have to look at all the labels on drugs anyway. But the problem is it's the only thing that's deemed safe during pregnancy for pain or for fever. If you take ibuprofen or you take aspirin, you increase the risk of some birth defects and some other complications. So the other thing is that it's apples to oranges, according to another researcher that I talked to, because pregnant women who need Tylenol are usually sicker or they have something going on, perhaps an infection. And so what do you do with that? And what's the effect of not treating that on the baby? Right. It's all very confusing.
I heard an analogy about what Holly addressed at the outset, which is the difference between correlation and causation. And the analogy I heard was in the summer it gets a lot hotter, and in the summer there's a lot more gang violence. But you can't equate heat to gang violence. They both occur simultaneously, but well, we don't necessarily associate one with the other. And the studies in this what we're talking about here, Lois, haven't really confirmed that in fact acetaminophen creates this risk. And in fact, I think the CDC spoke out later and said, "Wait a minute, we're not taking quite as strong a stance as the president
Correct.
did."
And even RFK Jr. kind of stepped back a little bit and said it's a potential issue. And the makers of Tylenol, Kenvue, are like, hey, show us the science behind this. We have not seen any science that shows any kind of causation. I don't think anyone has seen a causation study. So it's really confusing.
So one of the things that you point out in your article is there's a possible treatment. It's Leucovorin. It's a folate. So basically in the B6 category, this one's B9, I think.
It's B9,
And we do know that there are some folates, like folic acid. The taking of folic acid before you get pregnant can decrease the chance that your baby might have a neural tube defect like spina bifida.
Exactly, yeah.
It doesn't eliminate it completely, but we know that there can be something there, right? So it could be that this treatment might work symptomatically on some kids, but it seems to me like they were kind of pushing this pretty hard yesterday.
If you remember during COVID, there were a couple of cures that were pushed pretty hard that turned out not to be cures exactly or treatments. Right, exactly. So part of this that's interesting in pushing it so hard is that there is some hope, but it's even the scientists themselves say it's a fragile hope. We don't know. There were a couple of cases in a small clinical trial where children who were nonverbal had this, and the belief is that it's because folate has trouble crossing the brain barrier sometimes, so you don't get it into your brain in some people the way you should. In a couple of cases, within a few weeks of taking this particular medicine, in fact, children could speak. It did make some difference. I don't think we can discount it completely, but I don't think that we should all run out and get this for the people in our lives who have autism either. And the Autism Science Foundation said, we're watching it with interest, but it needs controlled studies. It needs lots of research before we're ready to say this is the treatment for autism.
Right. I mean, if you have a study with 2 people, that's pretty much anecdotal, right?
Yeah, and it was more than that, but it was a few people that had the effect.
Right. Yeah. So very, very small. It has to be something you can go and replicate. So we actually we already are to our break. Oh my gosh. So stay with us through the break, and we'll come back and continue our really fascinating conversation.
The new Inside Sources.
Following up on our discussion about the link between autism and the drug acetaminophen and the statement that President Trump made yesterday advising doctors and advising pregnant women not to take the drug during pregnancy because of that link. And ABC's News chief medical correspondent Dr. Tara Narula spoke this morning on Good Morning America.
There is not one single cause for autism. We know that it is a complex disorder characterized by hundreds of genes, different environmental influences, and part of the reason why we have seen these rising numbers that President Trump alluded to is because we are screening more, is because we've changed the diagnostic criteria.
So that's, it's one of the things that is interesting about this. And again, we have Lois Collins in studio with us, reporter with the Deseret News, to talk to us about her investigation and reporting on this news conference yesterday. Share with us some of the things that you were told or that you learned about potential causes of autism.
Genetics is believed to be a big risk. Environment is believed to be a risk, but nobody can say it's this or it's that. Most people believe that it's a combination. But the numbers have increased exponentially, and I would make it clear that most people believe the number of diagnoses has increased, not necessarily how many actual cases there are. It used to not be thoroughly diagnosed, and now we have an autism spectrum.
Right.
So it could be from mild to severe, and it's now believed that it's about 1 in 31, but they do think that it's mostly diagnosis.
It also was surprising, Lois, that the president would come out with such a broad stroke statement that you would expect to come from the medical community. And even the medical community is seemingly backing off a little bit from this. But he said, in no uncertain terms, don't take Tylenol or don't prescribe Tylenol.
Yeah, he said it multiple times.
Yeah, which, I mean, that had to surprise a lot of people.
Well, even in the one study that they cited from Mount Sinai and Harvard that found a somewhat of a link, they said, don't take it unless you have a high fever or unless you have a medical condition that really requires it. But they didn't say don't take it.
Right. And tell me, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, is ACOG. What was their statement?
So what they said is that Tylenol is the one thing, acetaminophen is the one thing that pregnant women who need it can take. And if you have a severe fever, if you have an infection or something, it needs to be treated. And so the risk of not treating whatever's underlying it that makes a woman sick, that makes her need these over-the-counter medications, that has to be dealt with because that also has some sort of potential to really harm a child.
And you have to expect that the makers of Tylenol have come out pretty aggressively and said, wait a minute, don't, trust your doctor, trust the current studies, don't necessarily jump to the gun because this has to be devastating to that product.
It's my understanding that their stock plunged a bit yesterday on the news. They have said that they expect to be sued by people who have children that have autism. And maybe the lawsuits will be a good thing. Maybe during discovery we'll get a really good look at the science and we'll know what the truth is of this. But it's got to be really kind of scary for them. And let's face it, those drugs we're talking about during pregnancy, but acetaminophen has many uses. So it's not just during pregnancy.
Right. It's one of the medications that people can take if you can't take NSAIDs, right? So if you've got trouble with ulcers or some other issue, right, that acetaminophen is something that has been considered safe. It's over the counter. A doctor can recommend it, but anybody can go down to the store and buy the generic version, which is acetaminophen, or the branded version, which is Tylenol.
Correct. And besides that, there are some known risks with it. If you have liver problems, if you take too much, you will have liver problems.
Sure.
So it's just like ibuprofen with kidneys.
Right.
You have to be careful and you don't overdo. But it's been around for a really long time.
Dr. Richard Ferguson, president of the Black Physicians of Utah, joined Midday with Maria Chaleos yesterday and spoke about why Tylenol and acetaminophen, how it's used, and how it works in the body.
They should be using Tylenol. Now, I think that probably the best way to think about this is let's just take a step back and say, why is Tylenol being used? Well, we use Tylenol to treat pain and fever. And even go a little bit granular here, if you give me a second. Acetaminophen or Tylenol, it blocks a particular enzyme in our body that is in our brain and our spinal cord. And this enzyme produces another chemical called prostaglandins. And these chemicals, when they're released, when this enzyme is activated, it produces this chemical, prostaglandin, that causes the increase in pain and body temperature. And all that acetaminophen does, it blocks this ability of this enzyme to produce more of that factor, prostaglandin, to cause us to have lower pain and fever. So we have to remember we're taking it for pain and fever. That's the indication. So, and it's one of the safest medications that's actually out there and has been studied. I think a lot of people don't, realize that there's not a lot of pregnant women raising their hand to be part of a double-blind, randomized controlled trial when their future child is at risk. But this is one of the medications that has been studied intently for some time.
So Lois mentioned it already, right? And Dr. Ferguson pointed out that not only are pregnant women not volunteering for these double-blind studies, right, because you may end up in the placebo group, right, or there may be harms caused for a new medication. So when scientists are looking at medications and what may or may not work, it's almost completely contraindicated to even have a pregnant woman in your study because of the potential risk to the baby. So saying we think if you take XYZ while you're pregnant, you could potentially prevent this, there have to be a lot of trials before you get to the pregnant women to even talk about that. But I wanted to say that Lois mentioned that the manufacturer of Tylenol is expecting an increase in lawsuits, and I wanted to ask you if Tylenol's manufacturer has any legal recourse for being thrown under the bus here.
Well, at some point, if they can follow up with studies that prove that what was said is incorrect, they could. I mean, right now, their back is against the wall a little bit, and they're going to face lawsuits of their own from people who took Tylenol and had children that may have been on the spectrum, and who will say, wait a minute, this was a causation that we should have known about. And I would expect that there's been no studies reasonable that Tylenol or the manufacturers of Tylenol have had in their pocket to say, wait a minute, we shouldn't be producing this right now because we don't have valid studies. Your question is, do they have a remedy? You know, it's hard to sue the government. We have what we call governmental immunity, and Trump has a high level of immunity. The Supreme Court's granted him over the years. So, you know, he says what he did based on the evidence that he had. I don't know that there's going to be much of a lawsuit against the federal government by Tylenol if and when they are proven to be a legitimate drug, and if it's proven, which it may or may not be, that they're not a source of problems with respect to pregnancies resulting in autism.
So, Lois, one final quick question. What was your big takeaway that pregnant women should know?
Well, I think the big takeaway is that you have to be careful about what you take during pregnancy. You have to be judicious, but I also think I also believe that you talk to your doctor, and if your doctor, who is more involved with you and with your health care, says you should take Tylenol. If you have a high fever, then you probably should take Tylenol if you have a high fever.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for joining us in studio. And we're just going to let our listeners know that we will have a doctor from Huntsman Mental Health Institute to talk more about autism at 11:35. So just stay with us. That's about an hour and a half from now.
That's what you were trying to tell me.
No,
you were like
fine.
Signaling me, and I'm like, what is Holly trying to tell me? So anyway,
we do not know sign language, and we should.
We're getting there. I would also say this, that there's probably reason to at least hesitate with respect to the second drug that they've talked about as a potential cure.
Leucovorin.
It may have some great prospects. It may be something that turns out quite well. I guess I'm a former engineer, scientist. I sort of trust the science a little bit, and you can go both ways. But I think there are going to be far more studies on both of these drugs in terms of the causation, in terms of the cure, as we go down the road.